Pay me hard 200, my son said. I smiled, called my lawyer, and flipped the script. Penalties, notices, ultimatum. What happened next will shock you. When my son told me I needed to start paying him rent to live in my own house, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I just smiled, walked to my bedroom, and made a phone call that would change everything. By the end of the week, he discovered what it really meant to have me as his landlady. What happened next will shock you, but first, let me tell you how we got here. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The morning it all started, I was making coffee in the kitchen of the house I'd lived in for 28 years. The same kitchen where I'd taught my son Marcus how to crack eggs without getting shells everywhere. The same kitchen where we'd celebrated his high school graduation with homemade cake. The same kitchen where his father and I had planned our retirement before cancer took him 3 years ago. Marcus shuffled in around 11, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair sticking up at odd angles. At 26, he should have been building his own life, but instead, he'd been living with me for the past year and a half, not contributing to groceries, not helping with utilities, barely keeping his room clean. But he was my son, and after losing his father, I couldn't bear the thought of being completely alone in this big house. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice carried that serious tone he'd inherited from his father, the one that usually preceded bad news or uncomfortable conversations. I poured him a cup of coffee, adding 2 sugars the way he'd liked it since he was 15. "What's on your mind, honey?" He sat down at the kitchen table, avoiding my eyes. "Look, I know this is going to sound harsh, but I think it's time you started paying your fair share around here." The coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus straightened up, suddenly looking more confident. "I mean, think about it logically. This house has 4 bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, a finished basement. If you were renting a place this size, you'd be paying at least $1,500 a month, probably more. I've been doing some research, and comparable properties in this neighborhood are going for $1,800 to $2,000. I set down my mug carefully, my hands surprisingly steady. "Marcus, this is my house. I've been paying the mortgage for 28 years. But that's just it, Mom. You're not paying a mortgage anymore. Dad's life insurance paid it off, remember? So now you're basically living here for free while I'm stuck paying for everything else. My car payment, my student loans, my credit cards. It's not fair." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my voice calm. "You're stuck paying for your own expenses?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my chest tightened. "Look, I know how this sounds, but hear me out. If we split the household expenses fairly, it would actually help both of us. You'd have more incentive to budget properly, and I'd have some extra money to start building my future." I stared at this young man who'd grown up in this house, who'd never paid a dime toward its upkeep, who'd moved back in with me during his lowest point and stayed because it was convenient. "Your future?" "Yeah, my future. I want to start investing, maybe save up for my own place eventually. But I can't do that when I'm carrying all the financial burden for both of us." The financial burden. I thought about the grocery bills I'd been paying, watching them double since he moved back in. The utility costs that had skyrocketed with his gaming setup running 24/7. The internet upgrade I'd gotten so his streaming wouldn't lag. The car insurance I'd kept him on because he said he couldn't afford his own policy. "How much rent did you have in mind?" I asked quietly. Marcus perked up, probably interpreting my calm tone as agreement. "Well, if we split everything down the middle, that would be fair. Property taxes, utilities, maintenance, insurance. I calculated it out, and your share would be about $1,200 a month. $1,200. To live in the house I'd bought, in the neighborhood I'd chosen, sleeping in the bedroom I'd shared with his father for 18 years. "That seems reasonable," I said, my voice so steady it surprised even me. "Really?" Marcus's face lit up with relief. "I mean, I know it's a big change, but I think it'll be good for both of us. More structured, you know, more like a real adult arrangement." "When would you want this to start?" "Beginning of next month gives us both time to adjust our budgets." Marcus was already pulling out his phone, probably to calculate how he'd spend his newfound windfall. "Oh, and Mom, I think we should put together some kind of written agreement, just to keep things clear and professional." "Professional." My son wanted a professional relationship with his mother. "Of course, honey." I stood up from the table, my coffee untouched and growing cold. "Let me think about the details and get back to you." Marcus grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Thanks, Mom. I really think this is going to work out great for everyone. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed I'd shared with my husband for nearly 2 decades. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the anniversary clock on my dresser, the one Robert had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary. 28 years in this house, 26 years raising Marcus in this house, 3 years of widowhood in this house with Marcus as my only family. And now he wanted to charge me rent. I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out my address book, the one with actual paper pages and handwritten entries. Some people might call it old-fashioned, but I liked having important numbers written down where they couldn't disappear if my phone died. I flipped through the pages until I found the number I needed. Margaret Chen, real estate attorney. We'd met at a grief counseling group after Robert died. Her husband had passed the same year, leaving her to navigate the complex world of property law and estate planning. She'd helped me understand Robert's life insurance policy and had offered to assist with any legal questions I might have in the future. I dialed her number, my fingers steady on the keypad. Margaret Chen's office, this is Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer, this is Susan Williams. I was wondering if Margaret might have some time to speak with me today about a property matter. Let me check her schedule. She has an opening at 3:30 this afternoon. Would that work for you? Perfect, I'll be there. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, looking around at the space that held so many memories. The dresser where Robert used to leave little love notes in my jewelry box. The reading chair where I'd nursed Marcus through countless childhood illnesses. The window where I'd watched him learn to ride his bike in our driveway, cheering every time he made it a little farther without falling. But memories didn't pay bills, and apparently, neither did being someone's mother. I pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. If Marcus wanted a professional landlord-tenant relationship, then he was going to get exactly that. But something told me he hadn't thought through all the implications of what he was asking for. At 3:30 sharp, I was sitting in Margaret Chen's office, my legal pad full of notes and questions. Margaret was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She listened without interruption as I explained Marcus's proposal. "So your son wants you to pay rent to live in your own house," she said when I finished. "That's correct." "And this house is titled in your name only?" "Yes. Robert's life insurance paid off the mortgage, and the deed is in my name." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Susan, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Your adult son, who lives with you rent-free, wants you to start paying him $1,200 a month for the privilege of living in your own home. When you put it that way, it sounds even more ridiculous." "It doesn't just sound ridiculous, Susan. It's legally problematic. You can't have a tenant-landlord relationship where the tenant owns the property and the supposed landlord has no legal standing." I shifted in my chair. "What do you mean?" Margaret pulled out a fresh legal pad and started sketching. "If Marcus wants to treat this like a business arrangement, then it needs to be structured like one. You're the property owner, which makes you the landlord. He's the person living in your property without a lease, which makes him either a guest or a tenant, depending on how you want to handle it." The pieces were starting to come together in my mind. So if I wanted to formalize our living arrangement, then you would be his landlady, and he would be your tenant. You would draft a lease agreement, collect rent from him, and have all the rights and responsibilities that come with being a landlord. "What kind of rights?" Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Well, as the property owner, you have the right to set the terms of occupancy. You can determine what areas of the house the tenant has access to, what the rent includes, and what additional fees might apply. You can establish house rules and enforce them. You can require security deposits, first and last month's rent, and you can raise the rent with proper notice." I was writing as fast as I could. "What about responsibilities?" "You'd be responsible for major repairs and maintenance, keeping the property up to code, that sort of thing. But you'd also have the right to inspect the property with proper notice to ensure lease terms are being followed." Margaret set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Susan, I have to ask, are you sure you want to go down this road? Family and business can be a complicated mix." I thought about Marcus's confident smile that morning, his casual dismissal of everything I'd provided for him over the years, his eagerness to treat our relationship as a transaction rather than a family bond. "Margaret, if my son wants a professional arrangement, then I think he should get exactly what he's asking for." She nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about market rates for rental properties in your neighborhood. For the next hour, Margaret and I went through comparable rental listings in my area. A 4-bedroom house with my square footage and amenities was indeed renting for $1,800 to $2,000 a month, but that was for the entire house. If Marcus wanted to be a tenant rather than a family member, then we needed to determine exactly what he was renting. His bedroom was roughly 12 by 14 feet. The finished basement where he spent most of his time gaming was another 400 square feet. He had access to one full bathroom, shared use of common areas like the kitchen and living room. Margaret did some quick calculations. Based on square footage alone, if we're talking about a fair market rent for the space he actually occupies, including shared common areas, we're looking at somewhere between $400 and $600 a month. But what if he wants exclusive use of certain areas? Then the rent goes up accordingly. If he wants the basement as his private space, that's additional. If he wants to restrict your access to certain parts of your own home, well, that's going to cost him. I was starting to see the bigger picture. What about utilities? Typically not included in rental agreements unless specifically stated. Internet, cable, electricity, gas, water, trash collection, there would all be separate charges based on usage. Margaret leaned forward. Susan, I want you to think carefully about this. Once you establish a formal landlord-tenant relationship, it changes everything. You can't just go back to being mother and son living together. There are legal protections for tenants, but there are also legal rights for landlords. I understood what she was saying, but I also understood what Marcus had said to me that morning. He wanted a business arrangement. He wanted me to pay him rent to live in my own house. He wanted professional boundaries instead of family bonds. Margaret, how quickly can you draft a lease agreement? She glanced at her calendar. I can have something ready by tomorrow afternoon. Perfect. And Margaret, I want it to be thorough. Every detail, every fee, every rule. If Marcus wants to play landlord, then he needs to understand what that actually means. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger, not sadness, but a strange sense of anticipation. Marcus thought he was so clever, manipulating his grieving mother into paying him rent. He thought he'd found an easy way to squeeze money out of someone who'd already given him everything. Tomorrow, he was going to learn the difference between being someone's son and being someone's tenant. The next morning, Marcus was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with his laptop open and papers spread out in front of him. He looked up with that same confident smile from yesterday. Mom, perfect timing. I've been working on our rental agreement all morning. I found some templates online and customized them for our situation. How thoughtful of you, I said, pouring myself coffee. What did you come up with? He turned his laptop toward me, and I could see he'd spent considerable time formatting a document that looked impressively official. Well, I figured we should keep it simple. You pay me $1,200 a month on the first, and that covers your bedroom, bathroom privileges, and access to common areas like the kitchen and living room. Bathroom privileges in my own house. That sounds very thorough, honey. Did you research local tenant rights while you were at it? Marcus waved his hand dismissively. Oh, we don't need to worry about all that legal stuff. This is just between family. But I did add a clause about keeping common areas clean and not having overnight guests without permission. Without permission from whom? From me, obviously. I mean, if we're splitting expenses 50-50, then we both get equal say in how the house is managed, right? I sat down across from him, noting how he'd positioned himself at the head of the table, the spot his father used to occupy. Equal say in managing my house. Marcus, I appreciate all the work you put into this, but I actually had a chance to speak with a real estate attorney yesterday. His confident expression flickered slightly. An attorney? Mom, that seems like overkill for a simple family arrangement. Well, since you wanted to keep things professional, I thought it was important to make sure we did everything properly. Margaret Chen specializes in landlord-tenant law. The color drained from Marcus's face. Landlord-tenant law. I pulled out the folder Margaret had given me, thick with legal documents and market research. Yes, it turns out there are quite a few regulations we need to follow if we're going to formalize our living arrangement. For instance, did you know that as the property owner, I'm automatically the landlord in any rental situation? But I thought we agreed that you'd pay me rent. Oh, honey, that's not how property law works. I own the house, which makes me the landlord. You live here, which makes you the tenant. If anyone pays rent, it would be you paying me." Marcus stared at the folder like it contained a venomous snake. "That doesn't make sense. I'm the one who brought up the idea of splitting expenses. And it was a wonderful idea. Margaret helped me calculate fair market rent for the space you actually occupy. Your bedroom is about 168 square feet, plus you have exclusive use of the basement for gaming, which is another 400 square feet. Shared access to kitchen, living room, and one bathroom." I opened Margaret's folder and pulled out the rental comparison charts. Similar spaces in this neighborhood rent for about $700 a month, not including utilities. $700? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "But that's not what we discussed." "You're absolutely right. We need to discuss the details thoroughly. For instance, utilities aren't typically included in rental agreements, so your share of electricity, gas, water, internet, and cable would be separate charges based on usage." Marcus was frantically scrolling through something on his laptop. "Hold on, let me look at these templates again." "Oh, those internet templates won't help much." Margaret explained that landlord-tenant relationships are governed by state and local laws that override any generic agreements. For example, as your landlord, I have the right to inspect your room with 24 hours written notice. You want to inspect my room? It's not about what I want, honey. It's about legal requirements for maintaining the property. I also need to ensure lease terms are being followed, that no damage is occurring, that sort of thing. Marcus closed his laptop slowly. "Mom, maybe we should reconsider this whole arrangement. But you were so enthusiastic yesterday. You said it would help both of us, remember? More structured, more professional." I pulled out another document from Margaret's folder. "Speaking of structure, here's the official lease agreement Margaret prepared. It includes everything you mentioned wanting. Clear financial responsibilities, professional boundaries, equal treatment under the law." Marcus reached for the document with trembling hands. His eyes widened as he scanned the first page. "Mom, this says the monthly rent is $750, due on the 1st of each month, with a late fee of $50 after the 5th. That's actually quite reasonable for this neighborhood. Margaret showed me comparable listings, and most were asking $800 to $900 for similar space. But what about all the utilities and maintenance costs you mentioned splitting? Those are listed separately, just like in any professional rental arrangement. Your portion of utilities averages about $180 monthly, based on your gaming setup's power consumption and internet usage." Marcus flipped through the pages, his confident demeanor evaporating with each clause he read. "It says here, I need to provide first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent before occupancy begins. Standard practice for any rental agreement. The security deposit protects against damages or unpaid rent." Margaret insisted on including that clause. "That's over $2,000 up front." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know it seems like a lot, but you said you wanted to start building your future through proper financial planning. This is exactly the kind of adult responsibility that will help you grow." He continued reading, his expression growing more panicked with each paragraph. "Mom, this section about house rules. It says no overnight guests without written approval, quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and no personal belongings in common areas. Those are fairly standard rental terms. Oh, and there's a clause about the basement. Since you spend most of your time down there, Margaret suggested treating it as a separate rental unit with its own additional fee." "Additional fee?" $200 monthly for exclusive basement access. It's actually quite generous, considering the square footage and the fact that I'd be giving up my storage space down there. Marcus set the lease agreement down like it was on fire. "This is insane. You're my mother, not some corporate landlord. Yesterday you wanted a professional arrangement instead of a family one. You said you'd done research and calculated fair expenses. You wanted everything structured and official. I thought you'd just pay me some money each month, not turn into this landlord person. But Marcus, you're the one who brought up rental rates and market values. You're the one who wanted a written agreement. Margaret and I simply took your ideas and implemented them properly." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to think about this." "Of course, honey. Take all the time you need. But keep in mind that if you decide to proceed with formalizing our arrangement, I'll need those upfront payments before we can execute the lease." Marcus stormed out of the kitchen, and I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, followed by the slam of his bedroom door. I sat quietly, sipping my coffee and reading through Margaret's beautifully detailed lease agreement. Every clause was perfectly legal, thoroughly researched, and exactly what Marcus had asked for. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I'd been enabling his freeloading by treating him like family instead of a tenant. Now that he wanted a business relationship, I was simply giving him exactly what he'd requested. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "How did the lease presentation go?" I typed back, "Better than expected. I think Marcus is beginning to understand the difference between being someone's son and being someone's tenant." 3 dots appeared immediately, then Margaret's response. "Give him time to process. Most people don't realize what they're asking for when they demand professional boundaries with family." She was right, of course. Marcus had spent his entire adult life taking advantage of family relationships without considering the alternative. He'd assumed that demanding rent from his mother would somehow put money in his pocket without any corresponding responsibilities. Instead, he was discovering that professional relationships came with professional expectations, legal obligations, and market-rate pricing. I finished my coffee and walked upstairs to Marcus's room. The door was closed, but I could hear him on the phone with someone, his voice agitated and defensive. "No, you don't understand. She turned the whole thing around on me. Now she's acting like some kind of corporate landlord with contracts and deposits and inspections." I knocked gently on his door. "What?" he called out. "Marcus, when you have a moment, we should discuss the timeline for your decision. Margaret needs to know whether to finalize the lease or void the agreement." Silence, then muffled conversation as he apparently covered his phone. "I'll be down in a minute," he finally said. I returned to the kitchen and started preparing lunch, humming quietly to myself. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own home again, not because I was being cruel or vindictive, but because I was finally treating Marcus the way he'd asked to be treated. As a tenant, not a son. 20 minutes later, Marcus emerged from his room looking like he'd been through a tornado. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, and he carried his laptop clutched against his chest like a shield. "I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." He set his laptop on the kitchen counter, his hands shaking slightly. "Did you plan this whole thing?" I looked up from the sandwich I was making, genuinely puzzled. "Plan what, honey?" "This whole landlord trap, making me look like an idiot with legal documents and market rates and professional boundaries." His voice cracked on the last words. "Marcus, you're the one who brought up rental arrangements. You calculated expenses, researched market values, and insisted on a written agreement. I simply took your suggestions to a qualified professional to make sure we did everything correctly. But you knew this would happen. You knew I couldn't afford $750 plus utilities, plus deposits." I set down my knife and turned to face him fully. "Did I know that my son, who hasn't contributed a penny to household expenses in 18 months, might struggle to pay market rent for the space he occupies?" "Yes, Marcus. I suspected that might be challenging for you." He slumped against the counter, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "So what happens now?" "That depends entirely on what you want to happen. You have several options." I counted them off on my fingers. Option 1, you sign the lease, pay the required deposits and rent, and we maintain a professional landlord-tenant relationship going forward. Option 2, you decide you'd prefer to find housing elsewhere that better fits your budget. Option 3, we go back to our previous arrangement. His head snapped up. "Previous arrangement?" "You living here as my son, contributing to the household as a family member, not as a paying tenant." "But what about splitting expenses? What about me having some extra money to invest and build my future?" "Marcus, if you want to build a future, you need to start by building a present. You can't construct a financial portfolio on the foundation of taking advantage of your widowed mother." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire neither of us had meant to start. "That's not what I was doing," he said quietly. "Then explain to me what you were doing when you calculated that I should pay you $1,200 a month to live in my own house." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I thought if we made it more official, more structured, then maybe." "Maybe what?" "Maybe I'd feel less like a failure living with my mother at 26. The admission hit me like a physical blow. I set down my sandwich and moved toward him, but he held up his hand. "Don't, Mom. Don't make this easier on me. I've been lying to myself for months, telling myself I was helping you by staying here after Dad died, that you needed the company. But the truth is, I needed a place to hide." "Hide from what?" from growing up, from taking responsibility, from admitting that I have no idea what I'm doing with my life. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what I did after college? I moved to Seattle, got a job at a tech startup, shared an apartment with 3 roommates. I was actually building something for myself. I remembered those phone calls from Seattle, Marcus excited about his work, talking about the projects he was developing, the friends he was making. Then Dad got sick, and I came home for Christmas. And after the funeral, when you seemed so lost and alone in this big house, I told myself I was staying to take care of you. But you weren't taking care of me. No, I was taking care of myself. Using your grief as an excuse to avoid going back to Seattle, back to real responsibilities, back to the life I was actually proud of. I sat down at the kitchen table, processing this revelation. Marcus, why didn't you tell me any of this before? Because it was easier to pretend I was the good son, sacrificing his future to help his mother, than to admit I was a grown man hiding in his childhood bedroom. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his laptop forgotten on the counter. And then yesterday, when I brought up the rent thing, I thought I'd found the perfect solution. I could stay here in my safe cocoon, but if you were paying me rent, then somehow that would make it legitimate. Like I was running a business instead of freeloading. The psychology of it was starting to make sense. Marcus hadn't been trying to take advantage of me maliciously. He'd been trying to rationalize a situation that made him feel ashamed. But when you showed up with that lease agreement this morning, Marcus continued, seeing all those professional terms and market rates and security deposits, it hit me like a brick wall. If I actually want a business relationship with you, then I have to act like a businessman. And businessmen don't live rent-free in their mother's houses. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of honesty settling between us. So what do you really want, Marcus? Not what you think you should want. Not what would make you feel less guilty, but what do you actually want for your life? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. I want to go back to Seattle. I want to finish the projects I was working on. I want to live in a place where I pay my own rent and buy my own groceries and feel like an adult. Then why haven't you? Because I was afraid you'd fall apart without me here, and I was afraid I'd fall apart without this safety net. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. Marcus, I've been a widow for 3 years. I've learned to live alone, pay my own bills, make my own decisions. I'm not going to fall apart if my adult son moves out and builds his own life. But what if I fail? What if I can't make it work in Seattle? Then you'll figure out a solution, the way adults do. You might move to a different city or find a different job or even come back here for a visit while you regroup. But you'll do it as someone who tried, not someone who never left his mother's kitchen. He squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Mom. About the rent thing. About taking advantage of your kindness. About using Dad's death as an excuse to avoid growing up. I squeezed back. I'm not sorry you stayed, honey. Having you here helped me through some very dark months after your father died. But we've both outgrown this arrangement. So what happens with the lease? I smiled. What lease? You're my son, not my tenant. If you want to stay here while you figure out your next steps, then you stay as family. That means contributing to groceries, helping with household tasks, and treating this like our home, not your personal hotel. And if I decide to go back to Seattle, then I'll help you pack, drive you to the airport, and be incredibly proud that I raised a son brave enough to build his own life. Marcus laughed, and this time it sounded genuine. You know, for a minute there, I actually thought you'd turned into some kind of ruthless slumlord. Oh, I was completely prepared to be your landlady if that's what you really wanted. Margaret Chen drafted a very thorough lease agreement. He shook his head in amazement. You would have actually gone through with it, wouldn't you? Absolutely. If my son wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, then I was going to make sure he understood exactly what that meant. Remind me never to underestimate you again. I stood up and returned to making my sandwich. Marcus, you've never needed to estimate me at all. I'm your mother. I'm on your side, whether you're living here as family or paying rent as a tenant or building a life in Seattle as an independent adult. He opened his laptop and started typing. What are you doing? Looking up flights to Seattle. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it before I lose my nerve. I watched him scroll through airline websites, his posture straightening with each click. This was the son I remembered from his college years, focused and determined and excited about possibilities. Mom, there's a flight tomorrow evening that gets me into Seattle by 9 p.m. I could be back at work by Monday. That's very fast. Are you sure you're ready? No, but I don't think I'll ever feel ready. Sometimes you just have to jump and build your wings on the way down. I finished making my sandwich and sat back down across from him. What about your things? Most of my stuff is still in storage in Seattle anyway. I can ship the few things I need from here. He paused his typing and looked up at me. Mom, will you really be okay? Living here by yourself, I mean. Marcus, I lived by myself for 52 years before I married your father. I think I can manage. But aren't you lonely? Sometimes. But loneliness is different from being alone. I have friends, activities, volunteer work. And now I'll have a son in Seattle who calls me because he wants to, not because he feels obligated to check on the old lady. He grinned. I'm going to call you constantly, probably more than when I lived here. I'm counting on it. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls, booking his flight, contacting his former roommates, reaching out to his old boss about returning to work. The energy in the house shifted completely. Instead of the stagnant atmosphere of someone hiding from life, there was movement, purpose, anticipation. That evening, we ordered pizza and sat on the couch watching old home movies, laughing at Marcus as a gap-toothed 7-year-old trying to ride his bike without training wheels. You know what's funny? Marcus said during a video of his high school graduation. I was so excited to leave home and start my adult life. When did I become someone who was afraid to leave home? Grief does strange things to people, honey. It makes us cling to familiar things, even when those things aren't serving us anymore. Is that what happened to you too, after Dad died? For a while, yes. I was terrified to change anything about this house, about our routines, about my life, as if keeping everything exactly the same would somehow bring him back. But you did change things. Eventually, I started volunteering at the library, joined a book club, took that watercolor painting class. Small steps, but they helped me remember that I'm still alive and still capable of growing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I think I forgot that too, that I'm still capable of growing. The next evening, I drove Marcus to the airport. His single suitcase looked impossibly small for someone restarting their entire life. Are you nervous? I asked as we pulled up to the departure curb. Terrified, but also excited. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be excited about the future. We hugged goodbye, and I watched him walk through the sliding doors into the terminal. For a moment, I felt the familiar pang of loss, the same feeling I'd had when he left for college 12 years ago. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't losing my son. I was watching him find himself. The drive home was quiet, but not lonely. I rolled down the windows and let the evening air fill the car, thinking about the empty house waiting for me. Not empty in a sad way, but empty in the way of a space ready to be filled with new possibilities. When I got home, I found an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in Marcus's handwriting. Inside was a check for $300 and a note. Mom, this doesn't come close to covering what I owe you for the past 18 months, but it's a start. I'll send more each month until I've paid you back properly. Thank you for loving me enough to let me grow up. Thank you for being willing to be my landlady when I needed to learn responsibility, and thank you for being my mother when I needed to come home. I love you, Marcus. I folded the note carefully and put it in my jewelry box, next to the love notes Robert used to leave me. Some treasures were worth keeping forever. The house felt different that night, bigger but not emptier, full of potential rather than stagnation. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, looking around at the space that was entirely mine again. Tomorrow, I thought, I might rearrange the furniture, maybe turn Marcus's room into the home office I'd always wanted, perhaps finally tackle that watercolor series I'd been planning. For the first time in 3 years, I was excited about tomorrow. My phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. I was still in my pajamas, enjoying my first cup of coffee in a house that felt different somehow, lighter, more like home and less like a hotel where I'd been both guest and staff. Mom? Marcus's voice came through clear despite the distance. I made it. I'm sitting in my old apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline, and I can't believe I'm actually here. I settled deeper into my reading chair, the one by the bay window where morning light streamed across the pages of books I'd finally had time to read again. How does it feel? Scary, amazing, like I can breathe again. He paused. Mom, I need to tell you something. Yesterday morning, when you presented that lease agreement, I called Jake in Seattle and told him what was happening. Jake had been Marcus's roommate before he moved back home, a software engineer with a practical streak and no tolerance for self-pity. What did Jake say? Marcus laughed, and I could hear embarrassment in his voice. He said, and I quote, "Dude, your mom is a genius. You asked her to be your landlord, so she's showing you what having a real landlord looks like. Either pay up or shut up." I like Jake. Yeah, well, he also said something else that hit me pretty hard. He said I'd been talking about coming back to Seattle for months, but every time he asked when, I'd make excuses. He said it sounded like I was afraid to leave my safety net. I sipped my coffee, remembering all the phone conversations where Marcus had mentioned missing Seattle, missing his work, missing the independence he'd had there. But somehow those conversations always ended with reasons why he couldn't leave just yet. Were you afraid to leave your safety net? Absolutely. But Mom, when I saw that lease with all those professional terms and security deposits, I realized something. If I'm going to act like an adult, I need to actually be an adult. I can't keep pretending that living with my mother at 26 is somehow helping her instead of helping myself. Through my window, I watched Mrs. Patterson from next door working in her garden. She was probably 75, living alone since her husband passed, and she maintained her own house, her own garden, her own independence. Just like I was learning to do. Marcus, there's something I need to tell you too. After you left last night, I realized that whole rent situation taught me something about myself. What's that? For the past year and a half, I've been enabling both of us to stay stuck. You, by providing free housing so you didn't have to face your fears about returning to adult life. Me, by convincing myself I needed you here so I didn't have to face my fears about being truly independent. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Mom, are you saying you were afraid too? I set down my coffee cup and really considered the question. Honey, after your father died, this house felt enormous and empty. When you moved back in, it felt full again. But it wasn't full of life. It was full of avoidance. Both of us avoiding the next chapters of our lives. So what's your next chapter going to look like? I looked around the living room, seeing it with fresh eyes. The furniture arranged the way Robert and I had liked it 20 years ago. The decorating choices we'd made together, never updated because changing them felt like losing him all over again. I think it's time for some changes around here. Maybe some redecorating. Definitely some reorganizing. Are you going to turn my room into something else? I was thinking about a home office, or maybe an art studio. I've been wanting to get back into painting. Mom, that sounds amazing. You should absolutely do that. We talked for another 20 minutes. Marcus told me about reconnecting with his old boss, about his former colleagues welcoming him back, about the projects he'd be working on. His voice carried an energy I hadn't heard in months. After we hung up, I walked upstairs to Marcus's room and stood in the doorway. The bed was made, his desk cleared except for a few items he'd decided to leave behind. High school trophies, some books he'd outgrown, a framed photo of him and his father fishing on Lake Challen the summer before Robert got sick. The room felt like a museum of childhood rather than a space where an adult had been hiding from life. I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Chen. Susan, how wonderful to hear from you. How did things work out with Marcus? Better than I could have hoped. He's back in Seattle, and I'm sitting in an empty house that feels full of possibilities. And the lease agreement? Served its purpose perfectly, even though we never signed it. Sometimes showing someone what they're really asking for is more effective than giving them what they think they want. Margaret laughed. That's the most insightful thing I've heard all week. So what can I do for you today? I'm thinking about some home renovations. Nothing major, but I want to convert my son's old room into a home office. Do you know any reliable contractors? As a matter of fact, I do. My neighbor just had her kitchen redone by a crew that does excellent work. Let me get you their information. As Margaret looked up the contractor's number, I found myself smiling. 6 months ago, the thought of contractors in my house, strangers tracking through rooms that held so many memories, would have sent me into a panic. Now it felt like exactly what this house needed. New energy, fresh perspectives, changes that honored the past while embracing the future. Susan, I have to ask, are you really okay with Marcus being so far away? I considered the question seriously. Margaret, yesterday I would have said no. Yesterday I was terrified of being alone in this house, but today I'm not alone. I'm independent. There's a difference. What's the difference? Alone feels like something happening to you. Independent feels like something you choose. After I hung up with Margaret, I made myself another cup of coffee and sat down with a legal pad. Not to plan revenge or strategic maneuvers this time, but to plan renovations. I drew a rough sketch of Marcus's room, imagining it as an office space, a desk by the window for natural light, bookshelves where his dresser used to be, maybe a small sitting area where I could read or plan my volunteer activities. The doorbell rang just as I was sketching in a reading nook. I opened the front door to find Mrs. Patterson holding a plate of fresh-baked cookies, her gardening gloves still dirty from her morning work. "Susan, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I saw Marcus leaving with a suitcase yesterday and wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything's wonderful, actually. Marcus got a job opportunity in Seattle. He left last night." Mrs. Patterson's face brightened. "How exciting for him, and how are you feeling about it?" I invited her in for coffee, and we sat in my kitchen while she told me about her own children, all grown and scattered across the country. She'd been widowed for 8 years, twice as long as me, and had navigated the transition from wife and mother to independent woman with grace I was just beginning to understand. "The first year after Harold died, I was terrified to be alone," she confided. "Every sound in the house at night seemed threatening. Every decision felt overwhelming." What changed? Time, mostly. And realizing that being alone and being lonely are completely different things. I can be surrounded by people and feel lonely if they're not the right people. But I can be completely alone and feel perfectly content if I'm doing things that matter to me. She took a bite of her cookie and smiled. "Besides, at our age, we've earned the right to live exactly as we please, don't you think?" After Mrs. Patterson left, I spent the afternoon researching home office designs online. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed having projects to plan, goals to work toward, changes to anticipate. For the past year and a half, my days had revolved around Marcus's schedule, his needs, his presence in the house. Now I was remembering what it felt like to make decisions based entirely on my own preferences. The contractor Margaret had recommended called that evening. His name was David Rodriguez, and he sounded professional but approachable over the phone. "Mrs. Williams, Margaret Chen gave me your number. She mentioned you're interested in converting a bedroom into a home office." "That's right. It's my son's old room, and he just moved out. I'd like to transform it into a workspace where I can manage my volunteer activities and maybe pursue some creative hobbies." "That sounds like a great project. Would you be available for me to take a look at the space tomorrow? I could give you some ideas and a rough estimate." Tomorrow would be perfect. After I hung up, I realized I was humming. Actually humming while I prepared dinner for one, something I hadn't done since Robert died. There was something deeply satisfying about making decisions quickly without having to consider anyone else's preferences or schedule. I made myself a simple salad and grilled chicken, ate at the kitchen table while reading a mystery novel I'd been trying to finish for months. Without Marcus's gaming sounds from the basement, without his irregular mealtimes disrupting my evening routine, I could actually focus on the story. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Just finished my first day back at work. Exhausting but amazing. How was your day?" I typed back, "Had a contractor coming tomorrow to look at your room. Going to turn it into my home office." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "That's awesome, Mom. Send me pictures when it's done. I want to see your creative space." Creative space. I like that phrase. Not just a home office, but a place where I could explore interests I'd put on hold while managing everyone else's needs. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a long bath with lavender salts, lit candles around the tub, and soaked until the water grew cool. No one was waiting for dinner. No one needed the bathroom. No one required my attention or assistance. For the first time in 3 years, I had an entire evening that belonged completely to me. The next morning, David Rodriguez arrived promptly at 9. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd been solving people's home improvement problems for decades. "This is a nice-sized room," he said, measuring the space where Marcus's bed used to be. "Good natural light, solid walls for mounting shelves or cabinets. What kind of work will you be doing in here?" I explained about my volunteer activities at the library, the book club I'd joined, my interest in maybe taking up watercolor painting again. So you need workspace, storage, and maybe an area for creative projects? David was already sketching rough ideas. We could build custom shelving along this wall, put a desk unit under the window, maybe a small table on the far side for art supplies. As he talked, I could see the room transforming in my mind. Not Marcus's childhood bedroom anymore, not a museum of memories, but a space designed entirely around my current interests and future goals. How long would a project like this take? 2 weeks? Maybe 3, depending on how elaborate you want to get with the built-ins. The good news is, most of the work is carpentry and painting, so we won't be disrupting your plumbing or electrical. I found myself nodding enthusiastically. When could you start? David checked his calendar. I have an opening next Monday. Would that work for you? Perfect. After David left, I called Marcus to tell him about the renovation plans. Mom, you sound different today, happier. I feel different, more like myself, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense. You know what's funny? I feel more like myself too, like the person I was before I got scared and started hiding at home. We both needed to remember who we were when we weren't taking care of each other. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Mom, can I ask you something? When Dad was sick, and especially after he died, did you ever feel like you lost yourself completely? The question caught me off guard with its honesty. Yes, honey. For a long time, I felt like I was just going through the motions of being Susan Williams, but I couldn't remember what that actually meant. That's exactly how I felt, like I was going through the motions of being Marcus Williams, but I'd forgotten what I actually wanted or cared about. And now? Now I remember. I love problem solving. I love the challenge of writing code that actually works. I love living in a city where I can walk to coffee shops and bookstores and museums. I love feeling like I'm building something meaningful. I smiled, thinking about my own rediscovered interests. I love organizing community events. I love reading books that make me think differently about the world. I love the idea of having a space that's designed entirely around my own creativity. We're both going to be okay, aren't we, Mom? Better than okay, I think. We're going to be ourselves. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is exactly what they ask for, even when it's not what they really want. Marcus thought he wanted me to pay him rent, but what he actually needed was to remember his own strength. I thought I needed him to stay, but what I actually needed was to rediscover my independence. When we stop enabling each other's fears and start honoring each other's potential, that's when real love begins. If someone in your life is asking you to be less than you are, maybe it's time to show them what more looks like.